Hi. So today we've got a slightly different venue in another ongoing attempt to review The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This is about my nth attempt. I've deleted so many because they very rarely seem to do justice. This was a magnificent book which I really enjoyed. Actually, I enjoyed it far more than I expected to. It's exceptionally well written. It's chock-a-block full of stuff. It's just a great read. So, without further ado, I shall try attempt number 20 whatever to review this really excellent book. It's a futuristic novel and it was published as sci-fi, I'm pretty sure, back in 1985, but the authors largely described it as speculative fiction, which is probably more what it deserves. It's not hard on science, it is very strong on the sociology. And since speculative fiction is a thing now, it's probably better described that way. Modern people are describing it as dystopian, but dystopian wasn't really a word back in 1985 when I originally read it. So, in its original publication, it was meant to be set in the near future, which might actually be 2005 or thereabouts, a future in which the US has had this major revolution, which is described very delicately in the novel and in the afterword, and they've established a republic which they have called Gilead. It's a totalitarian fundamentalist theonomy, which I had to look up because I hadn't heard of theonomies, and it claims to be biblically inspired, though Atwood is clearly challenging the level of actual religion as opposed to hypocritical religion in it. And this republic has insane levels of human rights abuses. So I read it back in the 1980s as a teenager and I liked it. I enjoyed all things futuristic back then, so I enjoyed this. I didn't love it, and so I was a little bit surprised a few years ago when there was this huge resurgence of interest in it in the 2000s. However, in hindsight, it does make sense. Atwood was originally writing it as a satirical commentary on a whole heap of various social and political and religious trends that were happening in the US. As a Canadian, she was a close neighbour to the US. She was in the perfect position to be satirical about it and to have fairly valid opinions. Now, these same opinions that she was commenting back then in the 80s have, with the use of her book of fiction, have just risen to relevance again, because once again in the 2000s you've got the Trump scenario and a whole heap of political, social and religious narratives that were even stronger perhaps than they originally were in the 80s, including restricting women's right to their own body, which is very much a feature of The Handmaid's Tale. So it makes sense for this resurgence in popularity, and now that I've read that, it makes more sense. When I first started hearing people raving in the last few years about The Handmaid's Tale, I was very snotty about it. It's like, well, how did it take them decades to figure out that book was there? It's a good book, but it's only one of many good books. I don't see what they're all about. Now I do. Past Deb was wrong, current Deb's figured it out. Yay. So the story starts in the now of our protagonist and narrator Offred, and I can't tell you what a relief to me it was to have a single protagonist. Apparently these days you can't write a single protagonist. In the here and now you have to have hundreds and timey-wimey stuff and hopping back and forth. This book does hop back and forth, but in context it does work. So Offred is not her real name. We never find out what that is. There's huge numbers of debates about it on the interwebs, but I'm not particularly interested. I don't think it matters. I think in the context of this book, not ever knowing what her real name is works, because it shows how much the Republic has stolen from her. It's essentially stolen her own identity from her as much as anything else. So Offred is a slave name given to her by the Republic of Gilead, and because Offred is essentially a sex slave allocated out to different men, specifically for breeding purposes. And we hear that the birth rates have been falling for a while for a number of reasons. There's major infertility. So the handmaids have been created. The handmaids are basically given out to people of status who haven't been able to have their own children to breed for them. And Offred, as a name, is a multi-pronged tool, I guess, because it isn't even her name. It's only her name while she's enslaved to this particular man, the commander in his household. He must be Fred. We're never told that either. He's just the commander, but she's Offred. And if she gets moved to another house, she might be Off Warren, or she doesn't even get to keep her own name or designation, which is, I'm going to say, intensely creepy. And the way that knowledge all knowledge in this book creeps up on you slowly is magnificent. It enhances the sense of helplessness that our protagonist has by understanding how this creeping factor has taken over the lives of so many people. Now, Offred is a handmaid because she was labelled as a wanton woman. It sounds so cute. I'm sure there's a band out there called that. Anyway, when the Republic took over the United States and shot its presidents and burned its constitution or whatever else they did, because they claimed to be a biblically based thing, they basically disqualified all annulments, which I'm going to say right now is not biblical because the Old Testament has allowances for divorce. But Gilead didn't approve of it. Since they disqualified all annulments retroactively, that meant that Offred's husband, who had previously been divorced, was still married, and that made her adulterous. Oh, by the way, I've got to say, many years ago I read that there's some Christian cult or rather in America, who goes around graveyards taking names of people who are dead and retroactively baptizes them or whatever it is into their own religion, which is wild and creepy and really reminded me of retroactively dissolving all annulments. So the US as a setting for a republic to be established in strange versions of Christianity is perfect. It's got plenty of strange versions of Christianity, just not Gilead yet, thank goodness. Right, so having been established as an adulterous woman, she and her husband, whose name might have been Paul, not sure, saw the way the winds were blowing. She and her husband and daughter all tried to escape Gilead across to Canada, and that made her a traitor. After this attempted escape, her daughter was stolen, and children who are stolen from people who aren't good enough to have children or whatever it is, are then offered to some other high-ranking official who rears them as their own children. Creepy, but definitely has precedence. Okay, so Offred becomes a handmaid. It could have been worse for her. A lot of traitors just get executed, arguably worse. But Offred is a provenly fertile traitor, so she gets sent to the Red Center, where she's going to be trained to be a handmaid. The other option over... Is that blinds? That's annoying. Hang on. No more blinds. There we go. Her other main option over becoming a sex slave, or if you will, a handmaid, but essentially, is probably to be sent to the colonies. The colonies are described throughout the novel as a horrible, horrible option where you do either hard labor or you clean up contaminated or radioactive waste, things like that. And throughout the book, I had some doubts as to whether these colonies even existed. They sounded like a threat that's being leveled against the citizens to keep them in order. But later in the book, there's actual suggestion that they do exist and that Offred's actual mother got sent to one, the real mother. So once you reach the prison, the Red Center, it's... Hello there. It's very much prison camp type vibe. It's harsh. The conditions are chilling. We learn them again by dribs and drabs through Offred's flashbacks. But later in the book we learn even more. So that's... What else? There's some other stuff I could say about the actual narrative. So Offred's in the house of the commander, and his infertile wife Serena Joy. This was interesting because Serena Joy is described as having been a famous televangelist before the Republic won its revolution. So she fought for the kingdom of Gilead, and at one stage she says one of the things they fought for is to get rid of divorce. But when they won, it ended up, instead of being a famous televangelist, TV personality with a career, she was forced to be a stay-at-home wife, and that's made her even more bitter and angry than she might otherwise have been. And it's an interesting reflection on Serena Joy, who's become a wife and isn't enjoying it, and Offred herself had lost her job when the Republic made it illegal for women to have jobs. So both of them were forced into the home, and neither of them enjoyed it. But instead of this forming a bond between them, it almost draws them apart, because Serena Joy, like most of the wives, absolutely hates the handmaidens, which I gotta say is probably an emotional response that you would say, though it's a little bit self-defeatist. So, what else happens? Oh yes, there's a description of the monthly fertility ceremony, which I'm not even going to try and describe on YouTube because I think I'll be cancelled. Eventually, Offred is nearing her last chance. Handmaids have to produce children or bad things will happen to them. They may be moved on to the next man, but it might be worse. So Serena Joy makes a pact with Offred to have sex with Nick, the chauffeur, who she believes is very loyal to her and the commander. And at the end of the book, Nick and Offred end up being lovers in a more extended sense than Serena Joy intended. So Serena Joy is one of the motivating factors behind this republic, but as soon as it doesn't suit her, she breaks the laws and does things that are legal under God and the republic, and that really highlights the abuse of power, really. And the same way, almost simultaneously, the commander is abusing his powers as well. He doesn't like the monthly ceremonies perhaps that much. They don't sound pretty unerotic. All he wants is to have someone come to his study with him of a night and play a game of Scrabble, and Scrabble of course is illegal because only men are allowed to read and write. So Offred is caught a sort of she doesn't really have a choice in these matters. She may have some sort of a choice, but it's not a lot. So she's kind of navigated into doing all these illegal things by the very people who are her jailers and her owners. And she gets things out of it. She gets cigarettes and sex from the Serena Joy side. She gets alcohol and the occasional outing from the commander. But in general, there's a lot of hypocrisy, and this part of the story shines a strong light on that hypocrisy. The ending is interesting and it's really good, and I'll mention it now. So, Nick the chauffeur may or may not be a spy, which are called eyes in this, and at the end, and he may or may not be affiliated with the eyes are part of the Gilead structure, but there's also an undercover, an underground resistance movement that's trying to get people out of Gilead, and they're known as Mayday. So Nick may or may not be an eye or a real eye, and he may or may not be part of Mayday, and that may or may not be real. So there's a lot of uncertainties happening there. Another side of the corrupt side of Gilead is seen through a childhood friend of Offred's that she catches up with. Moira was with her in handmaid training, but she failed and she's been sent to basically this huge sex club, which probably shouldn't exist under this strict religious organization that the Republic of Gilead is meant to be, but it clearly does. After that, the real end is when Offred is carted away by two of the angels, which are the Gilead police force, into a van and taken away. And what happens next, she doesn't know, and we don't find out either. It may be that Nick really loves her and that these supposed guardians are actually the underground and will smuggle her across the border to Canada or away in some other way. But she's sitting there in the van. She doesn't know which of the things is going to happen to her. And we don't know either, though we get a hint from the afterword, which I won't get to yet. So having finished the novel with great enjoyment, I then read up on it. But first of all, I've got to say, the real beauty of this novel is how well it is written. It is spectacularly written. It's got a well-paced, slow reveal. Its flashbacks aren't offensive. The sense of looming dread and lurking betrayal everywhere is amazing and reminds me of a visit to East Germany museums that I did a few years ago. I really loved it. The writing won me over. It's so good. It is literature in its own right, and it's worth reading for that alone. However, reading up on it, one of Atwood's controversial statements is that nothing in this book is invented, and apparently she was challenged on that a lot when it first came out. So she'd travel around with newspaper clippings, all these abuses that are in this book, and there's a lot of horrid ones that I haven't mentioned, have actual examples. She has the research to prove it. Among her described sources are the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 1978 to 1978 or thereabouts, 1979, which restricted women's rights and dress in a way that is not dissimilar to the way women's dress and rights are restricted by Gilead's. I would add the human rights abuses in general and state-sanctioned killings that were very much part of Iran. And that's topical again because the butcher of Tehran just died. Okay, she also mentioned Cambodia and Romania, 20th century communism, both of which countries promised utopian idealism type communities but failed to materialize. And again, to me, East Germany really comes into it. The Philippines under President Marcos had a lot of state-sanctioned killings that were sources for Atwood when she was writing this. So she was not just inspired by overseas examples, apparently. She claimed to have based a lot of the social abuses on Canadian politicians, probably American ones as well, who would profess this huge morality, Christian-based morality in public, but in private did not practice what they preached. And the prime example of that in this book is the commander, who is meant to be one of the authors of this new republic and the guardian of its morals, but he is completely immoral and hypocritical in public. Now, Atwood also studied the Puritans who settled in America from Europe, and she apparently feels that a lot of the religious side of this Republic of Gilead is based on what the Puritans were originally hoping to establish in America. The story of the disenfranchisement of women when removed from the workplace was meant to have been inspired by experience of women from post-World War II. So in the 1945s, when the men started coming back from war, the women had been drafted to do all the jobs that men weren't there to do. And when the men came back, they were often fired and forced back into the home against their will. So that was apparently some of the inspiration for the experience of Offred and Serena Joy in Gilead. This, by the way, is very much heralded as a work of feminist literature. And I assume because of its commentary on how women are very vulnerable to abuse under a religious or an ideologically human rights lacking regime. I don't know how to say this. And there's many aspects of this that have very interesting and relevant and coherent points to make about feminist points. I don't tend to focus terribly on feminist writing or feminist principles. I'm sure there's many reviewers out there who do, and if you're interested in that aspect, I would urge you to go and watch some of their content. I probably will at some stage as well. Religion. This is the big one, because the whole Gilead is meant to be based on the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it takes bits and pieces from all and melds them together. So Atwood saying that nothing that she does is new, I think that's very understating the situation. All the small facts might come from actual places, but the way she melds them together into this sinister conglomerate is just fantastic. And I do thoroughly recommend it for this. So the satire of Christian claims and the regimes justifying human rights abuses through their religion. It's a weird sort of Christianity. I don't think any actual Christian would recognize it as Christianity, but there's parts of it that very much have modern relevance to the way the US will cherry pick bits of Christianity that they like and try to enforce them in the absence of all the parts of the old book that might make sense. This book comes across as pretty scathing on its attitude towards using Christianity, or indeed probably any religion, to justify abuse and create social restrictions. According to some sources, that's just what the author was aiming for, but Atwood doesn't seem to me to particularly mean The Handmaid's Tale to specifically target religion. And I don't know that she's an atheist or anti-Christianity in general. But she is anti-handing that level of power to the people in the name of God or some other unchallengeable. And the point throughout The Handmaid's Tale is very much that level of power is going to end up being social abusive. And that's the case as with the examples she's made of both extreme religions and secular communism. And I think we can see it in the world over and over again. So The Handmaid's Tale is making this speculative fiction work, but I agree with Atwood, and even before I've read anything of hers back in the 80s, I could very much see that pretty much all of the abuses and all of the horrors that are showcased in the Republic of Gilead are based on people doing what people do in one place or another, which is often in pursuit of power. So if you see what I mean, this book is just jam-packed full of stuff, and sources from many different places come into play, and they get jigsawed together to make this picture that is chilling and fascinating and weirdly and regularly reminiscent of modern day experiences. You could write as much about this book as is actually in it, and I suspect most people have. So I guess we could finish on... I'm going to read a bit from here. Something is happening. There's a commotion, a flurry among the shoals of cars. Some are pulling over to the side as if to get out of the way. I look up quickly. It's a black van with the white winged eye on the side. It doesn't have the siren on, but the other cars avoid it anyway. It cruises slowly along the street as if looking for something. Shark on the prowl. I freeze. Cold travels through me down to my feet. There must have been microphones. They must have heard us after all. Off Glen undercover her sleeve grips my elbow. Keep moving, she whispers. Pretend not to see, but I can't help seeing. Right in front of us, the van pulls up. Two eyes in grey suits leap from the opening double doors to the back. They grab a man who is walking along. A man with a briefcase, an ordinary-looking man. Slam him back against the black side of the van. He's there a moment, splayed out against the metal as if stuck to it. Then one of the eyes moves in on him, does something sharp and brutal that doubles him over into a limp cloth bundle. They pick him up and heave him into the back of the van like a sack of mail. Then they are inside also, and the doors are closed and the van moves on. It's over in seconds, and the traffic on the street resumes as if nothing had happened. What I feel is relief. It wasn't me. And that is a beautiful, beautiful point that is made very evocatively, and it's a point that 1984 makes as well. It's like, what happens when you're in a totalitarian regime? Why don't you fight back? Is because you're always afraid it'll be you. It's like, what's that old say? First they came for someone else and I didn't speak up because I wasn't that someone else. Well, this is done beautifully in The Handmaid's Tale. Because of the constant fear, a whole heap of people don't do anything. Now that black van is the black van that comes to take Offred in the end and take her off somewhere. And moving on to the afterword. The afterword is called Historical Notes on the Handmaid's Tale, and it's presented as a transcript to the proceedings of the 12th Symposium of Gileadean Studies, which is an International Historical Association convention dated 2195, so considerably after the events and after we collect, Gilead has actually collapsed. It's an interesting thing. It's written as a symposium, and so it's dry. I feel that teenage Deb never bothered to read it. I think she got bored. But basically, this is a symposium paper being presented by someone who is allegedly the person who found the notes that this novel is based on in a metal box, making us feel that maybe Offred did escape, at least for a while, long enough to record her story and for them to be presented. But we also learn that this character with the very, very difficult name to pronounce, that's Pioxic, I don't know. Sounds quixotic, whatever it is. He apparently found these tapes that had been transcribed onto a tape recorder, and he transcribed them in order. So, and it clearly says they weren't labeled, so you didn't really know what was happening. So what starts off as a fairly unreliable narration, a very personal narration, but unreliable, is made doubly unreliable by the fact that it's been interpreted by someone who wasn't there by several hundred years. Do you see the similarity to the New Testament? I don't know if Atwood intended that, but it's really, really cute. So you've got this whole Handmaid's Tale, which is gripping and fascinating, and it's about this strange religion thing. But at the end we find it wasn't found or transcribed until hundreds of years after the event, or at least a few dozen years after the event. 2005-ish, 21, whatever. Yep, hundreds of years after the event. By someone who wasn't there, didn't see it, and is then presenting it as fact. Hello, New Testament. It's a shame that it's such a dry writing that it doesn't really give you a chance to fully cognitate how meaningful that afterword really is. That's all I can say. And it comes across very much as a symposium. I don't think anyone who hadn't been to many symposiums could do quite as good a job of it. Yes. So that's my review of The Handmaid's Tale. I shall upload it. I hope I'm happy with this one. Yes, I think I'm happy with this one. There's so much in it. You could talk about it forever. I would be happy to discuss with anyone else who wants to discuss it. And of course, this is 100% the book. I haven't seen the series. I think I saw one of the many movies many years ago. Don't remember it terribly well. Not interested in seeing the series at this point. Maybe one day I'll be stuck on a plane for 30 hours and I'll watch some of it. But the book, fantastic book. I do thoroughly recommend. Thank you for watching. And read good books, possibly this one.